Hey, everybody, welcome to Rooftop Leadership Podcast, where we talk about so many of the leadership issues that are on your mind and affecting your outcomes in life and business. And as a lot of you know, we do a lot of work with storytelling. We do a lot of training, and we look at different ways that stories, especially purposeful stories, can play a vital role in how we make deeper human connections and how we achieve inputs and outputs throughout our life. So, as a former Green Beret and as somebody who teaches human connection for a living, I'm always looking for the most relevant, the most impactful leaders in thought leaders in that circle. And I'm telling you, I'm thrilled to have, and who is, in my opinion, is the foremost leading thought leader and expert on story, Mr. Kendall Haven. And it may be Dr. Kendall Haven. If I said that wrong, please correct me, sir. But I am just a huge fan of your book, Story Proof, your book, Story Smart. I carry them with me everywhere I go. I've integrated several of the key lessons into the broader teachings that I do. And I'm a huge fan. So I appreciate you being on with our listeners, sir. And thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks.
And pleasure to be on with you.
Yeah. Well, look, we were starting to get into this before we actually started the interview, and I stopped you because I think even, your backstory of how you came into storytelling and the miles that you've traveled is just fascinating. So could you tell the listeners a little bit about your background, your backstory,
Sure.
and what uniquely brought you into story?
Sure. Probably best place to start, West Point. So graduated in 68, into the Signal Corps, working on satellite communication systems for the Army. Got out in 73, got my doctorate in oceanography, which has absolutely nothing to do with storytelling. So I usually go by Mr. now, just because any academics there are irrelevant to story. But I was working at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, one of the national research labs, and started to woo a woman who has for 38 years now been my partner and wife.
Congratulations.
She has a sister who has a boy, a son. She was a single mom. Boy was 4 when we linked up. And to get woo points, I'd take the kid to the park, give his mom a break. And one of the things I was supposed to do was make sure that he every now and then stopped and had a quiet moment, which I found out he was not in favor of at all. And would just run around the park. The only way, trial and error, I found I could keep him quiet. The only way I could was to say, hey, let's flop in the sandbox. I'll make up a story. Food wouldn't slow him down. Playing cards wouldn't nothing would slow him down, but a story would. And so I started, every time we go to the park, flop in the sandbox, make up stories for him, just to keep him quiet. And noticed that as soon as I started a story, this is the early 80s, pre-cell phone. So the assumption was if I was talking in the sandbox, I was talking to people who were actually there, not spread out around the world. Other people would drift by to listen. Kids would come over, adults would come over. I started to watch the adults, people in business suits. This is around San Francisco. I was in actually East Bay, but still urban San Francisco area. People in obviously business attire going from one place to another would slow down and lean in every time they'd come within earshot of a story. And one day it hit me that they listened to story material differently than we listened to anything else. If I sat in that sandbox and read any of the reports that I thought I was paid really good money by the Department of Energy to create, none of those people would have stayed and listened. But as soon as they perceived it was a story, they'd listen differently. And so I first fell in awe of that power. We couldn't get people the very people that paid us to do reports, to do studies, we couldn't get them to read the reports. We'd have to beg them to read a 1-page executive summary. every time we'd go back to Washington and try to get them to read our reports, they'd always say, well, tell me, what does it say? What does it say? And at the time, I didn't think anything of it. But really what they were saying is, okay, I don't want the report, I want the story. So it dropped out to become a full-time storyteller because I was just in awe of that power. And so a lot of the science, I instantly then, because I was the first person with a background in science to join the National Storytelling Association, became the person for who was in charge of all the research for the big questions that we were trying to answer, so we could validate the importance of story and storytelling. And those questions were, why do people listen to stories? Why do we remember stories? Why do we remember information better if it's housed within the context of a story than if we get the exact same information outside of that context? And by the way, the research is real clear. We do remember it better that way. Why do we recall story material better and more accurately? Those kinds of questions.
Right. And, Kendall, thank you for that backstory. And I think this sets us up perfectly to go right into the next logical part of this conversation, which is I spend a lot of time teaching and training human connection to some pretty skeptical folks, whether it's Green Berets, Navy SEALs, law enforcement officers, or, even bankers and financial advisors who deal in numbers and data all the time. A lot of, either left brain or folks who deal in science, or folks who just deal in hard reality where violence and trust deficits are, everywhere. And, they all look at me with a jaundiced eye a little bit when I talk about the power of story. And I think maybe if you could address it, why do we listen to stories the way we do? Why is it so powerful as a communication tool? And is it relevant to those communities that I just spoke about?
Okay. Let me answer that a couple of different ways. First, just a little summary statement for the research that we've been able to do. And then I want to back up into that research. A lot of that goes into that DARPA project that you had mentioned. Here's what we've been able to show. The human brain is hardwired to make sense of incoming information in very specific story terms. It doesn't matter if the person talking to you thinks they're telling a story. You make sense of it in story terms. So if you're the one who's trying to communicate, the people you're communicating to are going to make sense of your information at a subconscious level in story terms, and it happens before that information is passed on to the conscious mind.
Right.
You don't even know you've done it. A classic example, big accident in an intersection. After all the bodies are picked up and carted off to the morgue and to the hospital, the police go around, interview the witnesses, find 8 eyewitnesses, and get 8 completely different stories for what happened.
Right.
You think, well, that means that 7 out of 8 people are lying to the cops. No, they all told the truth. Why? Because we measure truth by what resides in your conscious mind. And en route to the conscious mind between sensory organs, eyes and ears, and the conscious mind, in order to make sense out of that stream of sensory images and sensory impressions that were coming in through the sensory organs, the subconscious mind had to convert it into story form. And in identifying what are the elements of that form that's the story structure that's naturally hardwired into the human brain, what we're identifying are what are the story tools that the person trying to communicate should use in order to make sure that their audience makes sense of their information the way you want them to. The second big question, of course, is then how do you create meaning from it? Well, we're a meaning-seeking species. Information comes into you, and you're always thinking, okay, what does it mean to me? What does this mean to me? What does it mean? What does it mean to me?
Right.
The version of that information that you use to create meaning is that self-created, story-based version that your subconscious mind created to make it make sense. So now that's easy to say. It took to to substantiate that kind of a statement, what it took was some agency, in this case it was DARPA, willing to put in some substantial amounts of money so we could go into mostly EEG, a little bit fMRI labs, wire up audiences, and very tightly control the information that they were being fed. So as we're watching, moment by moment, their neural signatures, we're looking for what is it that creates engagement, what creates trust, what creates or deflates emotional involvement in the story, what is it that it creates empathy, those understanding, those kinds of measures for which a whole lot of other working neuroscientists have worked up sort of what we'd call a neural signature, so that they can look at an EEG print and say, at this moment, here's what's going on in their mind. They're feeling their emotion. They are feeling empathetic toward the character you're talking about. They are feeling unempathetic toward the character, and so that I could then control the version of a story that the next audience got and the next audience got. So we're looking at what are the elements in story that create those internal responses in the brain. And that's the work really that brings us to the conclusion that human brain is really hardwired to make sense of incoming information in story terms. If you don't provide those story terms, those core story elements, if you're the communicator, what you do is force the audience to either infer them on their own, and they will. Someone's talking to you, and you find yourself thinking, "Why is he saying that? What does he really want? What's going on here?" And so you start to infer missing story elements. Either they do that or they tune out and just stop listening, because we all have lots of other stuff we'd like to dedicate our mental moments to. So we're always looking for reasons to tune out for incoming information.
So let me ask a question to that, Kendall, if you don't mind. Because I find this fascinating, is when you say, if we present, let's just say someone is talking to a associate of theirs about, their vision and their strategy for the upcoming year, and it's a lot of PowerPoint slides and a lot of raw data and charts. If I understand what you're saying correctly, is that the audience is going to use their own narrative capacity to make sense of what's being said before the conscious mind even processes that strategy or the numbers or anything else. The listener is going to form their own story in the absence of one that's told to them.
Right. A quick example. I don't know if I put this in the book or not. If I said to you, well, once there was a very young girl named Mary who desperately wanted some ice cream. Right. First sentence of a story. If I give you that sentence, and I've done this kind of a test with a whole lot of stories more recently in doing some other testing work, I give you that sentence and then say, how's this story going to end? What's going to happen at the very end of this story? First sentence again was, once there was a very young girl named Mary, who desperately wanted some ice cream. When I ask people to say, okay, what's going to happen at the end of that story? Every one of them, in one form or another, comes back to saying, well, she's either going to get her ice cream or she isn't. It's not the way the world works. That's the way your brain works. Wow. That is that neural story net taking control of incoming information. What did I give you? I gave you a character and a goal. Goal is what the character wants or needs to do or get in the story. Our brains are hardwired to mandate that a story will end when the main character resolves one way or the other their primary goal. So as soon as I say, once there was a very young girl named Mary who desperately wanted some ice cream, or for a company saying, here is in some way set up a goal for the next year. What I've done is set up structure that everyone will use to make sense of incoming information. Here's where it gets really important. Go back to Mary. I could have that story then go on and ramble for an hour. I could have her, I don't know, get kidnapped, escape somewhere in the middle of the jungles of Africa, and be scrambling up the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro while a dozen native kidnappers from Somalia come after her.
Right.
And all the time you'd be thinking, oh, this isn't going to help her get that ice cream. Every event in a story is given meaning, that is to say, value, based on its impact on the main character's ability to achieve goal. Mm. Most of the time when people are doing company and corporate presentations, they don't stop and say, okay, who is my audience going to think is the main character of this story, and what's the goal? And set those up so that every time new information comes in, they're interpreting it and giving it meaning the way you want them to.
Wow.
They're going to do it.
Yeah.
They're always going to do it. The question is, who controls it? You, the communicator, or are you leaving it up to them and taking a chance that they'll interpret it correctly?
That's so critical. And what I want to do, I think I've seen a path for us here. I'm going to ask you two more follow-up questions, Kendall. And then for the second part of this interview of proof, power, and purpose of how stories make better connections, I'm going to let you riff on a few things that need to be in a story to make it effective.
Okay.
So, but the two things that you've written about that I think are so critical is my first question is, did you find in any of those studies where you wired up to the brain that occupations or disciplines that work in a more programmatic or data-based environment are less receptive to story, or did you get a look at any of that?
For the DARPA study, when we were wiring people up, no, we didn't see any difference at all. I will get a couple of other studies. One of them I was a small part of, and a couple of other related ones have been done, but I wasn't actually part of them. Here in California, around the wine industry. And the question was about how to get investment into a winery, how to attract more investment into a winery. The one that I was part of was for a winery here, growing winery, a fairly well-established winery, but one that wanted to expand a lot and buy up some other small wineries and acquire more vineyard space. So they were looking for a big capital infusion. So they're going to the number of people, investment people, and so it was all accounting, and everyone said, okay, we just want to see the numbers. We just want to see the numbers. Show us the numbers, and we'll make a decision on whether it's a good investment or not. We were able to break them into three groups that came in on 3 different days. Every one of them saw the exact same portfolio of all of the statistics, the numbers. Group 1 got that, and that's all they got. Group 2 got that, met the owner, and had a little short talk by him. And Group 3 got the whole story of the family that had moved over from Italy in 1900 whatever, I think it was 1908, set up the winery and the personalities, and got the story of what they were after and what made them excited about wine, blah, blah, blah. And there were about 8 people in each of these groups from different investment companies. So they were then reporting back individually. So we had a number of people, companies, investors responding to each of those 3 from each of those 3 sessions. Consistently, the group that had heard the story even though they, just as the other groups, claimed all they wanted was the numbers and all they were going to look at was the numbers. Consistently, the people from that group were willing to invest up to 30% more in this winery than the other two.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I've seen the same thing, Kendall, working on in corporate America.
There are hundreds of those kind of examples around. That was just one that I happened to be part of.
Right.
But the story has to be relevant to the numbers.
Yeah.
But still, the story will influence substantially how you interpret and make sense of those numbers, because the numbers themselves have to be interpreted, have to be looked at and analyzed and thought of. And so providing the story that creates perspective for the way that you look at the numbers then controls the way you look at the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. When we were doing village stability operations in Afghanistan, and I found myself doing a lot of work with local tribal elders to, influence them, inspire them to allow us to live in their communities and to get them to make a stand against the Taliban. This was late in the war. The bulk of the connections that myself and some other leaders were able to make were usually in the realm of personal story. For example, I would talk about tobacco farming in Western North Carolina and the way my grandfather and dad and now I had to do that. And I would make more connections with those Southern Pashtun farmers through that would lead to a whole host of life-changing transactions to include, standing shoulder to shoulder in a firefight. But it started, Kendall, with a very relevant story about low-tech, hard farming, similar to what those tribal men had to do in Kandahar.
Yep. It's unfortunately, the best I can do is, because I haven't spent a lot of time trying to track this back, is track it back into England at about the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s. Sometime in there is when story suddenly, with the rise of the quote unquote scientific age, the word story started to get linked to fiction and to lies and to untruths and to what you use when you don't have anything else to use to substantiate your argument. And I don't know quite how and why that became a popular conception, but there's absolutely no truth to it. The most powerful arguments are those that combine story and the data that back up the story.
Absolutely.
And the story explains the data back up the story.
Yep.
Every effective story, every effective communication has to work on that level, especially when you're doing things other than for entertainment purposes.
Yeah.
When you're trying to be purposeful in them, when you're trying to influence people.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the key that we've been looking at the last 5 years is how do stories exert and control influence? Influence being changing attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior. It's not a negative. Influence is not related directly to propaganda. It's just every time you communicate, what you're trying to do is influence somebody for something.
Right. So that's probably the best place to break this portion off, Kendall. And for those of you who are just joining us or who need a review, mostly what we've been talking about with story expert Kendall Haven is contained in his book, Story Proof, The Science Behind the Startling Power of Story. Frankly, the most compelling piece of work out there on why story works and how it works. If man, I'm telling you, if you don't have this book in your kit bag, you need to have it because the work that has gone into this speaks for itself. It's got the science behind it, but it's written like a story, and it just reads beautifully. So we're going to stop there, and when we come back for our next episode with Kendall Haven on proof, power, and purpose of how stories can help you make deeper connections. I'm going to ask him to go into some of the elements of Story Smart, his other prolific book on how story can influence and what you as a leader should think about at a minimum. Does that sound like a plan, Kendall?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Thanks for everybody that's listening. This is the Rooftop Leadership Report. I'm here with Mr. Kendall Haven. And make sure you join us on our next episode where we talk about Story Smart and how you can influence through purposeful, powerful stories. Thanks for listening.